What is Plato's theory of forms?
The theory, or doctrine, of forms, also called the theory of ideas, is Greek philosopher Plato's, c. 428 to 347 BC, expression of his belief that there are forms that exist outside the material realm, and therefore are unchanging. They do not come into existence, change, or pass out of existence. It is these ideas that, according to Plato, are the objects or essence of knowledge. Further, he posited that the body, the seat of appetite and passion, which communes with the physical world, rather than the world of ideas or forms, is inferior to the intellect. He believed the physical aspect of human beings to be irrational, while the intellect, or reason, was deemed to be rational. The origins of Plato's theory can be traced to Socrates, c. 470 to 399 BC, who believed that the psyche, inner spirit, has intuitive access to divinely known principles or truths, which he attempted to formulate through his conversations with others. Indeed, the Socratic dialogues, written by Plato, reveal that Socrates was striving to define the exact nature of the traditional Greek moral virtues of piety, temperance, and courage.
What was the French and Indian War?
The French and Indian War, 1754 to 63, was the last major conflict in North America before the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 83. During colonial times, both Britain and France had steadily expanded their territories into the Ohio River Valley. Since the fur trade prospered in this region, both countries wished to control it. But as the French encroached on their territory, the British colonists sent an ultimatum to them. This message was delivered by none other than George Washington. 1732 to 1799, who had been sent by the British governor. But the French made it clear that they did not intend to back down. So in 1754 Washington, now a lieutenant colonel, and 150 troops established a British outpost at present-day Pittsburgh, not far from where the French had installed themselves at Fort Duquesne. That spring and summer fighting broke out. Washington met the French, and though he and his troops mustered a strong resistance, there were early losses for the British. But a reinvigorated British force, under the leadership of Britain's Secretary of State William Pitt, 1759 to 1806, took French forts along the Allegheny River in western Pennsylvania and met French troops in battle at Quebec. In 1755 Washington was made colonel and led the Virginia troops in defending the frontier from French and Indian attacks. Though the British finally succeeded in occupying Fort Duquesne in 1758, at which time Washington temporarily retired to his farm in Virginia. Fighting continued until 1763 when the Treaty of Paris ended the war. The British won the spoils, gaining control of all French lands in Canada as well as French territories east of the Mississippi River, with the exception of New Orleans. The city was ceded to Spain, along with its holdings west of the Mississippi. Spain had become an ally to France late in the war. In 1762, in exchange for Havana, Cuba, Spain turned over Florida to the British. France, which had once controlled a vast region of America, retained only two small islands off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, and the two Caribbean islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe.
What was the importance of Martin Luther's 95 Theses?
The Reformation as a movement began on October 31, 1517, when the German monk and theology professor Martin Luther 1483–1546, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, Saxony, Germany. The Theses, which are arguments or assertions, question the value of indulgences, the pardons that were disseminated by the Church, and condemned the sale of them. Luther had already begun to preach the doctrine of salvation by faith rather than by works. And during 1518 he went on to publicly defend his beliefs, which were in direct opposition to the Church. The following year he expanded his argument against the Church by denying the supremacy of the Pope. In 1521 Pope Leo X, 1475–1521, declared Luther a heretic and excommunicated him. Ordered to appear before the Diet of Worms in April 1521, Luther refused to retract his statements of his beliefs, saying, "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, I am bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God." The following month, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, 1500–1558, issued the Edict of Worms, declaring Luther to be an outlaw and authorizing his death. But the Prince of Saxony, known by history as Frederick the Wise, 1463–1525, saw fit to protect Luther, whom he had appointed as a faculty member at the University of Wittenberg. Founded by Frederick the Wise in 1502. There Luther translated the New Testament into German and undertook a translation of the entire Bible. Luther continued the Protestant movement until his death in 1546.
What are the bodies and agencies of the United Nations?
The UN's Charter establishes 6 main bodies and explains their duties and operating methods. The General Assembly is the major forum, all member nations are represented there, and the Assembly can discuss any issue that is deemed relevant and important to the UN. The Security Council has the major responsibility for preserving peace. The Economic and Social Council investigates economic questions and works to improve living standards. The Secretariat is the UN's administrative body, helping all organs do their work. the Trusteeship Council assists non-self-governing territories. And the International Court of Justice hears disputes between member nations. Except for the last one, all bodies convene in the UN headquarters in New York City. The International Court of Justice meets in The Hague. Since the Charter was written in 1945, the United Nations has established numerous agencies, committees, and commissions to help carry out its work around the world. Among those that are most well known to the public are the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, which encourages the exchange of ideas among nations. The United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, which assists children and adolescents worldwide, particularly those in devastated areas or developing countries. The World Health Organization, WHO, which promotes high health standards around the globe. The International Labour Organization, ILO, which works to improve labor conditions and protect workers. And the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which addresses currency and trade issues.
What are WMD?
WMD are weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons that can cause extensive casualties. The term emerged during World War II, 1939-45, the abbreviated WMD became part of everyday language in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as the world's superpowers and the United Nations turned their attention to serious threats posed by rogue states and terrorists in a post-Cold War society. Following the launch of the 2003 Iraq War, WMD were regularly in the news. The Bush administration and its chief ally, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953, faced sharp public criticism when no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. The presence of WMD in that rogue state had been the justification for the controversial invasion. In 2004, President Bush appointed a bipartisan commission to look into why U.S. intelligence agencies had concluded that Iraq possessed WMD. In late March 2005, the commission released to the public an unclassified version of its report. The conclusion: intelligence errors had overstated Iraq's WMD programs. It stated, the daily intelligence briefings, before the Iraq War, were flawed. This was a major intelligence error. The Commission outlined 74 recommendations to improve intelligence gathering among the United States' 15 spy agencies. The classified version of the report contained information on the intelligence community's assessments of the nuclear programs of many of the world's most dangerous actors. It also provided more details on intelligence concerning the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. In Britain, the intelligence failures concerning Iraq spurred a years-long controversy, which damaged Blair's approval ratings and posed tragic consequences. In addition to the loss of life in Iraq, British Weapons Inspector David Kelly took his own life after publicly accusing the government of overstating the need for war. As in the United States, Britain took steps to tighten controls on its intelligence gathering to prevent errors in judgment. Despite the fact that no WMD were found in Iraq, the White House stood firm on the decision to invade Iraq. On September 11, 2004, the Office of the Press Secretary released a fact sheet titled 3 Years of Progress in the War on Terror. The document stated in part, "We were right to go into Iraq. We removed a declared enemy of America, who had defied the international community for 12 years. And who had the capability of producing weapons of mass murder. And could have passed that capability to the terrorists bent on acquiring them. Although we have not found stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. In the world after September 11, that was a risk we could not afford to take."
Who was Genghis Khan?
He was a Mongol conqueror who rose to power in the early 13th century. To rule over one of the greatest continental empires the world has seen. Born Temujin, c. 1167–1227, he was named Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. In 1206, he was a fearless military leader, a brilliant strategist, and a ruthless subjugator, known for his brutal methods. Temujin was the firstborn son of the leader of a small nomadic clan. When he was a young boy, his father was killed by a neighboring tribe, Tatars, and thus he rose to the status of chief. But instead of allowing a boy to lead them, clan members abandoned Temujin and his family. He survived the hard-scrabbled youth of a destitute nomad. But by all accounts, he seemed destined to become a great leader. By the time he was 20 years old, Temujin had managed to forge alliances with various tribal leaders and claimed the leadership of a small clan. By 1189 he united 2 Mongol tribes, which he organized to conquer the rival Tatars by the year 1202. At a conference of Mongol leaders in 1206, Temujin was pronounced the great ruler, or Genghis Khan, of the unified Mongolian state. He began a transformation of the Mongol tribes, dividing them into military units, each one supported by a number of households. He imposed law and order, promoted education, and stimulated economic prosperity. Within 5 years, Mongol society was changed from a nomadic tribal to a military feudal system. Thus organized, Genghis Khan prepared his troops to expand the Mongolian Empire. Genghis Khan's armies embarked on a series of military campaigns, claiming land and subjugating peoples, sometimes using barbaric methods. By 1213 he controlled northern China to the Great Wall. By 1219 he controlled most of China and began campaigns into the Muslim world. When he died in the field in 1227, Genghis Khan commanded the vast territory from China to the Caspian Sea. He was succeeded by his sons, who continued to expand the Mongol holdings. His grandson was Kublai Khan, 1215–1294, under whose leadership the Mongolian Empire reached its pinnacle.
Why is the Renaissance considered a time of rebirth?
The term Renaissance is from the French word for rebirth, and the period from AD 1350 to 1600 in Europe was marked by the resurrection of classical Greek and Roman ideals. The flourishing of art, literature, and philosophy, and the beginning of modern science. Italians in particular believed themselves to be the true heirs to Roman achievement. For this reason, it was natural that the Renaissance began in Italy, where the ruins of ancient civilization provided a constant reminder of their classical past, and where subsequent artistic movements, such as Gothic, had never taken firm hold.
Why is Johannes Kepler important to modern astronomy?
German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571–1630, put forth the theory that planets, including Earth, rotate around the Sun in elliptical orbits. But he had the help of research conducted by astronomer Tycho Brahe, 1546–1601, to use as a basis for his conclusion. In 1600 Kepler moved to Prague, Czech Republic, where he began working as an assistant to the flamboyant Brahe, a Danish aristocrat who a few years earlier, in 1576, had set up the first real astronomical observatory in history. Brahe's benefactor in this work was none other than King Frederick II. 1534–1588, ruler of Denmark and Norway, who was a patron of science. In the observatory, Brahe had made and recorded extraordinarily accurate observations of planetary positions. Even though he rejected the Copernican, sun-centered, view of the universe because it violated church beliefs, he also realized that his observations of the planets could not be explained by the Ptolemaic system. He soon put forth his own theory of planetary orbit. The tectonic theory was something of a compromise between the two existing models. The sun-centered system of Copernicus and earth-centered system of Ptolemy. Brahe's model followed Copernicus's theory in that it, too, had the planets orbiting around the Sun, but it kept to the Ptolemaic belief that the Sun orbited Earth. In this way, he accounted for a year. The theory was ignored. But when Brahe hired Kepler in 1600, he turned over his observations to him and charged him with the task of devising a theory of planetary motion. As a mathematician, Kepler was the right man for the job, and he devoted himself to the effort for the next 20 years. At one point, Kepler had devised a scheme that almost matched Brahe's observations, but not quite. Believing Brahe's observations were perfectly accurate, Kepler threw out the scheme and started again. Finally, he gave up on using circular orbits and epicecles. Smaller orbits centered on the larger ones, and began working with ellipses, ovals. When Kepler charted the planets' orbits as ellipses, the results matched Brahe's data. In 1609 Kepler published his first two laws of planetary motion, in the work Astronomia Nova. A planet orbits the Sun in an ellipse, not a circle, as Copernicus had believed. And a planet moves faster when near the Sun and slower when farther away. We also have Kepler to thank for a word that is in everyday use, satellite. After Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter, Kepler used a telescope to view them for himself. He dubbed them satellites. Satellis is from the Latin meaning attendant, a name that stuck. The celebrated astronomer also did pioneer work leading to the invention of calculus, late 1600s.
Is it true that Moses stuttered?
Yes, the Bible indicates that Moses had a speech impairment, which caused him to fear the mission that God gave him. In the book of Exodus, 4:10, just after Moses has been called by God and told to go to the Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he appeals to the Lord, saying, "If you please, Lord. I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue," and, later, 4:13, "If you please, Lord, send someone else." God reassures Moses and instructs him to go meet his brother Aaron the Levite, who is eloquent and will speak to the people for Moses.
When was the first heart transplant?
The world's first heart transplant took place on December 3, 1967, in Cape Town, South Africa. Surgeon Christiaan Barnard, 1922–2001, conducted the operation. The patient lived for 18 days. Over the next 2 years, more than 100 heart transplant operations were performed. But the survival rate was not encouraging. Surgeons have continued the practice with moderately improved results. While some heart recipients have lived as long as 6 years after the procedure, only 20% of the recipients survive more than 1 year.
Who was Cesar Chavez?
Mexican-American farm worker Cesar Chavez, 1927–1993. Was a labor union organizer and spokesperson of the poor. Born in Arizona, his family lost their farm when he was just 10 years old. They became migrant workers in California, where farm production, particularly of grape crops, depended on the temporary laborers. Chavez knew the migrant workers' life intimately, and as a young man he began working to improve conditions for his people. In 1962 he organized California grape pickers into the National Farm Workers Association. 4 years later this union merged with another to form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or UFWOC. The name was changed to the United Farm Workers of America, or UFW, in 1973. An impassioned speaker known for squishing bunches of grapes in his hands as he delivered his messages. Chavez went on to lead a nationwide boycott of table grapes. Since growers had refused to accept the collective bargaining of the UFWOC. By the close of the 1970s, California growers of all crops had accepted the Migrant Workers Union, now called the United Farm Workers. Like Martin Luther King Jr., Chavez maintained that nonviolent protest was the key to achieving change.
What was the first American university?
It was Harvard, chartered on October 28, 1636, by the Massachusetts General Court, which passed a legislative act to found a college. It was not until November of the following year, however, that there was further action. It was then that the General Court decreed that the college be built in Newtown, Massachusetts, which in 1638 was renamed Cambridge after England's Cambridge University, where some colonists had studied. In fall of that year, Harvard's first professor, Nathaniel Eaton, began classes, at which time the first building was under construction and a library was being assembled. The university got its name not from a founder, but from a newly arrived British philanthropist and colonial clergyman, John Harvard, 1607 to 1638. Who left the library some 400 volumes and donated about £800 to the college. The institution was named in his honor in 1639, the year after he died. The first state university was the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It was founded in 1789. And in 1795 it became the first public institution of higher education in the United States to begin enrolling students.
Who were the Danes?
The Danes are the Scandinavian people of Denmark. Their origins date as far back as 100,000 years. Beginning at about the time of Christ, c. 30 AD. The Danes were organized into communities that were governed by local chieftains. During the 6th and 7th centuries they participated in the Viking, pirate, raids of England, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. These last three are sometimes referred to as the Low Countries. In about 950 Denmark was united by King Harald II, also called Harald Bluetooth, c. 910 985. Who 10 years later was converted to Christianity and thereafter fostered its spread. The Vikings gained control of England in 1016, and the Dane warrior Canute became King of England, and of Denmark. The Danes ruled England until 1042.
What was the Long March?
The Long March began in October 1934 when Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976, led Chinese Communist forces. The Red Army of China, numbering 100,000 men and women, on an epic walk across China, with the Nationalist Army in pursuit. The Communist marchers crossed 18 mountain chains and 24 rivers to cover 6,000 miles. Almost all women and children died along the way. In 1935, 20,000 to 30,000 people finally reached Shaanxi, Shenzi, province in the north, where the Red Army established a stronghold. It was there that Mao, one of the earliest members of the Chinese Communist Party, formulated his own philosophy that came to be known as Maoism. He had adapted Marxism to the Chinese conditions, replacing German politician and socialist Karl Marx's 1818 to 1883, urban working class with the peasant farmers as the force behind revolution. The Red Army went on to defeat the Nationalists in 1949. Mao was named chairman of the People's Republic of China, a communist state, that same year.
Is Stravinsky the 20th century's foremost composer?
The Russian-born American composer Igor Stravinsky, 1882 to 1971, is certainly one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. Stravinsky wrote concerts, chamber music, piano pieces, and operas, as well as ballets, for which he may be most well known. Between 1903 and 1906 Stravinsky studied under the great Russian composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, 1844 to 1908. In 1908 Stravinsky wrote his first work of note, the orchestral fantasy Fireworks, which was in honor of the marriage of Rimsky-Korsakov's daughter. The piece caught the attention of Sergei Diaghilev, 1872 to 1929, of the Ballets Russes, who invited the young composer to participate in the ballet company's 1910 season. Ballets Russes had dazzled audiences the year before, bringing new energy to the art form. In collaboration with Diaghilev, Stravinsky went on to create masterpieces The Firebird, 1910, Petrushka, 1911, and Rite of Spring, 1913, among them. The partnership served to elevate the role of the ballet composer in the art world. Rite of Spring is either Stravinsky's most famous or most infamous work. It was first performed by the Ballets Russes in the third week of its 1913 season. The choreography was arranged by the famous dancer Vaslav Nijinsky, 1890 to 1950. But the performance stunned both the music and dance worlds. So extreme was the audience's reaction to this premiere work that a riot nearly broke out inside the theater. Stravinsky had composed his music not to express spring's idyllic qualities but rather its turmoil and dissonance, similar to childbirth. Nijinsky paired Stravinsky's composition with complicated and visually frenzied dance movements. Later characterized by the composer as a jumping competition. Though many thought it a disastrous performance, when the ballet's Russes continued to London. Rite of Spring was more widely accepted there largely because the audience had been duly prepared for it. The following year, Rite of Spring was performed in concert in Russia, but the reaction was mixed. The young composer Sergei Prokofiev, 1891–1953, was in the audience and later wrote that he had been so moved by the work that he could not recover from the effects. Listeners today are still moved by the elevated rhythm of Rite of Spring, which makes an entire orchestra into a kind of sustained percussion instrument. Ultimately, most musicians and critics came to regard the watershed work as one of the finest compositions of the 20th century.
How did modern dance begin?
American dancer and choreographer Martha Graham, 1894–1991, is the acknowledged creator of modern dance. She was 35 years old when the Martha Graham Dance Group made its debut on April 14, 1929. Ushering in a new era in dance performance. The new form of dance dissolved the separation between mind and body and relied on technique that was built from within. Graham's interest in dance had begun in her youth. And as an astute observer and manipulator of light and space, she came to be regarded later in life as one of the masters of the modernist movement on a par with artist Pablo Picasso, 1881–1973. She is credited with revolutionizing dance as an art form. In her hands it had become nonlinear and non-representational theater. Choreographing some 180 works in her lifetime, she also taught many students who rose to prominence as accomplished and masterful dancers, including Merce Cunningham and Paul Taylor.
Is it true that Edison had no formal education?
It's almost true. Thomas Edison, 1847–1931, had no formal education to speak of. Born in Milan, Ohio, Edison's father moved the family to Port Huron, Michigan. In 1854, their young Edison attended school for the first time in a one-room schoolhouse where he was taught by the Reverend and Mrs. G. B. Engel. But this arrangement lasted just a few months. The boy grew impatient with his schooling behavior his teachers interpreted as a sign of mental inferiority. When Edison overheard Mrs. Engel refer to him as addled, he reported it to his mother, Nancy, who promptly withdrew him from the school. From then on his mother taught him at home, introducing young Edison to natural philosophy, a mixture of physics, chemistry, and other sciences. He showed an inclination toward science, and by the age of 10 he was conducting original experiments in the family's home. Edison furthered his education through voracious reading. he sought, and was granted, permission to sell periodicals, snacks, and tobacco to passengers on the train between Port Huron and Detroit, Michigan, some 60 miles away. During the layover in downtown Detroit, Edison spent his time at the public library, where, according to his own recollection, he read not a few books, but the entire library. Even though he lacked a formal education, Edison possessed a keen mind and a natural curiosity. Further, he had the benefit of the schooling provided by his mother as well as access to a library, of which he took full advantage. Then something happened that changed Edison's life. While still a young man, he lost his hearing. Biographer Matthew Josephson explains that the deafness had two effects on Edison. Not only did he become more solitary and shy, but Edison turned with an even greater intensity toward his studies and began to put forth tremendous efforts at self-education, for he had absolutely to learn everything for himself.
What was the Chinese-Japanese War?
It was a war fought in 1894 to 1895 over control of Korea, which was a vassal state of China. When an uprising broke out in Korea in 1894, China sent troops in to suppress it. Korea's ports had been open to Japan since 1876, and in order to protect its interests there, Japan, too, sent troops to the island nation when trouble broke out. But once the rebellion had been put down, the Japanese troops refused to withdraw. In July 1894, fighting broke out between Japan and China, with Japan emerging as the victor, having crushed China's navy. A peace treaty signed on April 17, 1895, provided for an independent Korea, which only lasted until 1910, when Japan took possession, and for China to turn over to Japan the island of Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula. The peninsula was later returned to China for a fee after Russia, Germany, and France forced Japan to do so. The war, though relatively brief, seriously weakened China, and in the imperialist years that followed, the European powers scrambled for land concessions there.
Why did John Hancock go down in history as the notable signer of the Declaration of Independence?
Most Americans know that when they're putting their John Hancock on something, it means they're signing a document. It's because of the 56 men who signed their names to the historic document. It was Hancock, 1737 to 1793, who, as president of the Second Continental Congress, signed the Declaration first. The events were as follows. On July 2, 1776, Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, presented the draft of the Declaration to the Second Continental Congress, which had convened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, more than a year earlier, on May 10, 1775. The congressional delegates of the 13 colonies then deliberated and debated the draft, making some changes. A section was deleted that condemned England's King George III, 1738 to 1820, for encouraging slave trade. Other changes were cosmetic in nature. On July 4 the final draft of the Declaration was adopted by Congress. And it was then that it was signed by Hancock. The document was then printed. A few days later, on July 8, the Declaration was read to a crowd who assembled in the yard of the State House. On July 19 the Congress ordered that the Declaration of Independence be written in script on parchment. It is that copy that in early August was signed by all 56 members of the Second Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence is housed, along with the U.S. Constitution, 1788, and the Bill of Rights, 1791, in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., where it is on display to the public. John Hancock went on to become governor of Massachusetts, from 1780 to 1785 and from 1787 to 1793.
What was the Beat movement?
The post-World War II era bred unprecedented prosperity and an uneasy pace in the United States. Out of this environment rose the Beat generation. Alienated youths who rejected society's new materialism and threw off its square attitudes to reinvent cool. The Beat generation of the 1950s bucked convention, embraced iconoclasm, and attracted attention. Mainstream society viewed them as anarchists and degenerates. But many American youths listen to and read the ideas of its leaders, including writers Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, whose novel On the Road, 1957, was the Bible of the Beat movement, William Burroughs, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti. The Beatniks, as they were dubbed by their critics, believed in peace, civil rights, and radical protest as a vehicle for change. They also embraced drugs, mystical, Eastern, religions, and sexual freedom, all controversial ideas during the post-war era. Beat writers and artists found their homes in communities like San Francisco's North Beach, Los Angeles's Venice Beach, and New York City's Greenwich Village. The movement merged, or some would argue, gave birth to the counterculture movements of the 1960s, including the hippies. Beat literature is the movement's legacy.
Which came first, the word Scrooge or Dickens's character Scrooge?
The character Ebenezer Scrooge came first. Brought to life in Charles Dickens's extremely popular story A Christmas Carol, published in 1843. By 1899 the term Scrooge, meaning a miserly person, had entered into usage. Dickens, 1812 to 1870, created many memorable characters. Oliver Twist, Tiny Tim, and Little Nell, to name a few. Among the English writer's most notable works are Oliver Twist, 1837-39, The Old Curiosity Shop, 1840-41, Bleak House, 1852-53, A Tale of Two Cities, 1859, and Great Expectations, 1860-61. Dickens was popular during his own time and is still popular today, attributable not only to the vivid characters he created, but for his expression of social concerns. Though he grew more pessimistic in his later works, Dickens continued to demonstrate his profound sympathy for the oppressed and his belief in the dignity of man.
What became of John Cabot's son, Sebastian?
Sebastian, c. 1476-1557, who was born in Bristol, England, and sailed with his father on his successful expedition to North America the summer of 1497. Did not take part in his father's ill-fated venture the following year. Had he done so, the world would have lost another great adventurer. Since that expedition was never heard from again. Instead, Sebastian stayed behind and pursued his father's cause and that of other merchant navigators, who were determined to find overseas trade routes to the east. During his lifetime, Sebastian Cabot drew up maps for both the English and Spanish royalty, and from 1525 to 1528 led a Spanish expedition that reached South America's Rio de la Plata, and sailed into the Parana and Paraguay rivers. In 1544 Cabot published an engraved map of the world. And 7 years later, under a pension from King Edward VI. 1537 to 1553, he founded the Merchant Adventurers of London. This group sponsored expeditions seeking a northeast passage, around Europe, to establish a trading route to the east. In so doing, the group effected trade with Russia.
What was the Lyceum movement?
It was a public education movement that began in the 1820s and is credited with promoting the establishment of public schools, libraries, and museums in the United States. The idea was conceived by Yale-educated teacher and lecturer Josiah Holbrook. 1788 to 1854, who in 1826 set up the first American Lyceum in Millbury, Massachusetts. He named the program for the place a grove near the Temple of Apollo Lycurgus, where the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle 384 to 322 BC, taught his students. The Lyceums, which were programs of regularly occurring lectures, proved to be the right idea at the right time. They got underway just after the completion of the Erie Canal. 1825, which permitted the settlement of the nation's interior. Just as the notion that universal, free education was imperative to the preservation of American democracy took hold, the movement spread quickly. At first the lectures were homegrown affairs, featuring local speakers. But as the movement grew, Lyceum bureaus were organized. which sent paid lecturers to speak to audiences around the country. The Lyceum speakers included such noted Americans as writers Ralph Waldo Emerson. 1803 to 1882, Henry David Thoreau, 1817 to 1862, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1804 to 1864. As well as activist Susan B. Anthony, 1820 to 1906. After the Civil War, 1861 to 65. The educational role of the Lyceum movement was taken over by the Protestant-led Chautauquas.
Why did Spain authorize Columbus's expedition in search of a westward route to the Indies?
When Christopher Columbus, born Cristoforo Colombo, 1451 to 1506, who was Italian, became convinced that Earth was round. He had been studying the writings of Ptolemy, and that he could, therefore, reach the east by traveling due west across the ocean. He first took the idea to the King of Portugal to seek his financial aid. This was about 1483. The move was a natural one. He had settled in Portugal at the age of 25, married a Portuguese woman, who bore him one son before she died. And Portugal was the leading seafaring nation of Europe at that time, carrying out southbound voyages with the intent of rounding Africa and reaching the Indies to the east. But Columbus was rebuffed by the Portuguese monarch. When in 1484 he took his plan to the Spanish monarchs, King Ferdinand, 1452 to 1516, and Queen Isabella, 1451 to 1504, they too refused to back him. But Columbus persisted, and in 1492 the Spanish king and queen agreed to sponsor the explorer's plan. There were two reasons for the decision: the overland trade route to the Indies. India and its adjacent lands and islands in the Far East had long been cut off by the Turks, and the Western Europeans found themselves in need of finding a new trade route to the Far East. Further, Ferdinand and Isabella were devout Christians, as was Columbus, and they all shared a desire to advance the Christian religion. In short, the monarchs saw that there were both material and religious advantages for backing Columbus's expedition.
Who invented the hot air balloon?
French papermakers Joseph Michel, 1740 to 1810, and Jacques Etienne, 1745 to 1799. Montgolfier built the first practical balloon filled with hot air. On June 5, 1783, the Montgolfiers launched a large balloon at a public gathering in Annonay, France. It ascended for 10 minutes. 3 months later, they sent a duck, a sheep, and a rooster up in a balloon, and the animals were landed safely. This success prompted the Montgolfiers to attempt to launch a balloon carrying a human. In October 1783, French scientist Jean-François Pilatre de Roger, 1756 to 1785, became the first person to make a balloon ascent, but the balloon was held captive, for safety. The following month he became one of 2 men to make the first free flight in a hot air balloon, which ascended to a height of about 300 feet over Paris on November 21, 1783, and drifted over the city for about 25 minutes. Hot air ballooning, which proved to be better than the rival hydrogen-filled balloon developed in France at about the same time, became very popular in Europe. In January 1785 hot air balloonists successfully crossed the English Channel. From Dover, England, to Calais, France. Across the Atlantic, hot air balloons made their debut in the United States in Philadelphia in 1793 before. A crowd that included George Washington, 1732 to 1799, who was then President of the United States.
How many were injured in the September 11 attacks?
The exact number of injuries resulting from the attacks is not known. Data from the aftermath show that thousands of people were treated in hospitals after the attacks. Some sustained serious physical injuries such as burns, eye injuries, and respiratory problems. But exact figures on the number and extent of injuries could not be gathered. Partly because some had chosen not to receive medical treatment or had received it later. According to a September 2004 report by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, a multitude of physical and mental health effects have been reported in the years since the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, but the full health impact of the attack is unknown. Concern about potential long-term effects on people affected by the attack remains. The report cites several injury categories including respiratory health, reproductive health, and mental health. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, alone was thought to have affected a great number of New Yorkers, particularly emergency responders and children. According to the report, PTSD is an often debilitating and potentially chronic disorder that can develop after experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event. It includes such symptoms as difficulty sleeping, irritability or anger, detachment or estrangement, poor concentration, distressing dreams, intrusive memories and images, and avoidance of reminders of the trauma. Mental health specialists reported that people across the nation demonstrated symptoms consistent with PTSD after the 9/11 attacks.
What happened to the hippies?
The conflict in Vietnam ended, flower children grew older. Drugs took their toll on some, and by 1980 there was no such thing as free love. Still, a few continued to lead an alternative lifestyle. While at the opposite end of the spectrum others bought back into the establishment. Still others adapted their flower child beliefs to the ever-changing world around them and got on with their lives. working at jobs and raising children in the most socially and politically conscious way possible.
What was the monkey trial?
The July 1925 trial of Dayton, Tennessee, public school teacher John T. Scopes, 1900-1970, was dubbed the monkey trial because at issue was Scopes's teaching of evolution in his classroom. Having yielded to religious beliefs in creationism, the story of human origins told in the Bible's book of Genesis. Tennessee state law prohibited teaching public school students about the theories of English naturalist Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882. Darwin's scientifically credible work The Origin of Species argued that humans had descended from ape-like creatures. Celebrated attorney Clarence Darrow, 1857 to 1938, defended Scopes. Lawyer and former presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, 1860 to 1925, known as the Great Commoner, argued the prosecution. For 12 days in the summer of 1925, the small town in eastern Tennessee became the site of a showdown between modern scientific thought and traditional fundamentalism. Or as some observed, between cosmopolitan and rural America. Spectators crowded the courtroom, eventually forcing the proceedings to be moved to the courthouse lawn. Journalists issued daily reports, which were published in newspapers across the country. It was headline writers who dubbed the case the monkey trial. Darrow made history when he called Bryan himself to the stand. It was a daring move on the defense attorney's part. But since Bryan eagerly accepted the summons, the judge allowed the questioning. Darrow first got Bryan to agree that every word in the Bible is true. Then he set in to reveal the hazards of such a literal interpretation, asking, for example, how Cain had found himself a wife if he, Adam, Eve, and Abel were the only 4 people on earth at the time. Darrow succeeded in shaking the prosecutor, who finally admitted that he did not believe Earth was made in 6 days. Bryan retaliated by accusing Darrow of insulting the Bible, to which Darrow replied, I am examining you on your fool ideas that no Christian on earth believes. It was drama better than any novelist could write. Darrow lost the case, which was later overturned on a technicality. Scopes had only been charged a $100 fine for violating the state law, which was repealed in 1967. But the trial, preserved in the play and film Inherit the Wind, is still remembered today. Scopes's crime was not sensational, his trial did not break any legal ground. And the defense had not won a brilliant victory, but the proceedings, carried out in the midsummer heat of the American South, epitomized the era and, ultimately, made for a great story.
What was Nietzsche's philosophy about the will to power?
The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche 1844 to 1900, developed many theories of human behavior, and the will to power was one of these. While other philosophers, including the ancient Greek Epicurus, argued that humans are motivated by a desire to experience pleasure, Nietzsche asserted that it was neither pleasure nor the avoidance of pain that inspires humankind, but rather the desire for strength and power. He argued that in order to gain power, humans would even be willing to embrace pain. However, it's critical to note that he did not view this will to power strictly as a will to dominate others. Nietzsche glorified a superman or overman. Übermensch, an individual who could assert power over himself, or herself. He viewed artists as one example of an overman since that person successfully harnesses his or her instincts through creativity and in so doing has actually achieved a higher form of power than would the person who only wishes to dominate others. A notable exception to Nietzsche's esteem for artists was the composer Richard Wagner. 1813 to 1883, whom the philosopher opposed. Since Wagner led an immoral lifestyle, unlike the Übermensch, Nietzsche maintained that the composer had not gained power over his own instincts. Nietzsche was a professor of classics at the University of Basel in Switzerland from 1868 to 1878. Retiring due to poor health, he turned to his writing, which included poetry. In 1889 he suffered a mental breakdown and died the next year. After his death, his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, 1846 to 1935, altered her brother's works in editing, changing their meaning. In 1895 she married an anti-Semitic agitator, Bernhard Forster, 1843 to 1889, who, with his wife, attempted to establish a pure Aryan, a non-Jewish Caucasian, colony in Paraguay. The effort failed, and Forster took his own life. These events and, more importantly, the changes to the philosopher's own words resulted in the popular misconception that Nietzsche's philosophies had given rise to Nazism.
How old is animal experimentation?
Scientific experimentation using animals including mice, rats, rabbits, guinea pigs, monkeys, and dogs dates back to ancient times. But the practice did not become widespread until the late 19th century. Clinical experimentation, which includes vivisection, surgery on live animals, has yielded benefits to human health. But because it often results in the suffering and death of the animals, many people are against the practice. Tens of millions of animals are used for experimentation in the United States today. Official estimates cite that mice and rats account for some 90% of this number. The practice remains controversial as people grapple with the issues surrounding animal rights and weigh these considerations against improved scientific understanding of illnesses.
What is the worst flood in history?
The worst flood to date occurred in China in 1887, when more than 900,000 people died as the Huanghe. Yellow, river overflowed. China is particularly susceptible to severe and regular flooding. The Huanghe River alone typically floods 2 out of every 3 years. And because river valleys are densely populated, the human toll is often great. A 1939 flood in North China claimed more than 500,000 lives.
Who was Dame Margot Fontaine?
Fontaine, 1919 to 1991, has been called an international ambassador of dance. The British-trained ballerina achieved worldwide fame and recognition during more than 34 years with the Royal Ballet, expanding the company's female repertoire and becoming the model for the modern ballerina. In 1962, at the age of 43, Fontaine formed a dance partnership with Soviet defector Rudolf Nureyev. 1938 to 1993, challenging traditional assumptions about the ability of mature dancers to continue vigorous performance careers. In her later years, she continued to be active in the world of dance, helping set up dance scholarships, fostering international artistic relations, and encouraging the growth of dance institutions around the world.
What are England's royal houses?
England's royal houses are simply families, including ancestors, descendants, and kin. Since 1066, England's rulers have come from a series of 10 royal houses. Normandy, ruled 1066 to 1135, Blois 1135 to 54, Plantagenet, 1154 to 1399, Lancaster, 1399 to 1471, York, 1471 to 85, Tudor, 1485 to 1603, Stuart, 1603 to 49, restored 1660 to 1714, Hanover, 1714 to 1901, Saxe-Coburg, 1901 to 10, and Windsor, 1910 to present. Prior to the establishment of the House of Normandy, England had been ruled by Saxons and Danes since 802. The first king of the House of Normandy was William I, also known as William the Conqueror c. 1028 to 1087, who was the son of the French Duke of Normandy. William invaded England in 1066 on the death of Edward the Confessor and the accession of Harold II. c. 1022 to 1066. Ousting Harold, William was coronated at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day. William's grandson, Stephen, was all that consisted of the short-lived reign of the House of Blois. Named such since Stephen was the Count of Blois and Chartres. Though he was raised in the court of his uncle, King Henry I, whom he succeeded. The House of Plantagenet, also called the House of Anjou, included the 10-year reign 1189 to 99, of Richard I, or Richard the Lion-Hearted, 1157 to 1099, who fought his father. Henry II, 1068 to 1135, and his brothers for control of the throne. Richard's military prowess made him the hero of romantic legends. Thereafter, two contending branches of the House of Plantagenet, the houses of Lancaster and York, vied for the crown in the infamous War of the Roses, 1455 to 85. The struggle finally ended when Henry VII, a Lancaster, ascended the throne and married into the House of York, reuniting the two sides of the family under the newly minted House of Tudor. The Tudors were a famous lot, remembered for the reigns of Henry VIII. 1509 to 47, and his daughters, Mary I, 1553 to 1558, and Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603. The Tudors were followed by the Stuarts, whose reign was interrupted by the establishment of the Commonwealth and Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658. The house was restored to power, giving history the 8-year period known as the Restoration. In 1660, it was King William III, 1650 to 1702, a Stuart, and Queen Mary II. 1662 to 1694, who began in 1689 to rule England in a more modern fashion through Parliament. A Stuart descendant, George I, 1660 to 1727, established the House of Hanover, which originated in Germany. Queen Victoria, 1819 to 1901, who presided over the Victorian age, 1837 to 1901, was of the House of Hanover. She was succeeded by her son, Edward VII, 1841 to 1910, who established the House of Saxe-Coburg. Technically, this is the royal house still at the helm today. The name was changed to Windsor during World War I, 1914 to 18.